You sit in your therapist's office, and there's this moment, this suspended breath, where you're about to describe what's really happening to you. The energy sensations that move through your body like rivers of electricity. The way you've started perceiving synchronicities everywhere, as if reality itself is speaking directly to you. The voice of inner guidance that's become clearer than your own thoughts. The experience of dissolving completely, where the boundaries of yourself seem to evaporate into something vast and boundless. And then you stop. Something in you hesitates. Some instinct whispers that crossing this threshold, speaking these truths aloud in this room, might change everything in ways you cannot undo. Before we go any further, if you're experiencing a spiritual awakening and navigating the complex terrain of therapy, subscribe to Alan Watts Insights. This channel exists to help you understand these profound transformations through the lens of wisdom that bridges east and west. Hit that notification bell, because what we're exploring today might be the most important conversation you never knew you needed to have. That hesitation you feel, it isn't paranoia, it isn't resistance to healing, it's an intuitive recognition of a very real danger that exists at the intersection of two worlds, the world of spiritual awakening and the world of Western psychiatry. These two systems operate with fundamentally different maps of human consciousness, and when an awakened soul walks into a conventional therapeutic setting speaking the raw language of their experience, the consequences can be devastating. Let's be clear about what we're discussing here. We're not suggesting that therapy is harmful, or that mental health support isn't valuable, or that psychiatric conditions don't exist. What we're examining is far more nuanced and far more crucial for your journey. We're talking about the very real phenomenon where authentic spiritual experiences that have been recognized, honored, and guided by wisdom traditions for thousands of years are pathologized, misdiagnosed, and suppressed by a medical system that lacks the conceptual framework to distinguish transformation from psychosis. Alan Watts understood this danger intimately. In his work exploring the intersection of Eastern philosophy and Western psychology, he pointed out that our culture has a profound discomfort with ego dissolution. He observed that Western psychology pathologizes the very experiences that Eastern traditions consider essential to awakening. When someone reports the dissolution of the separate self, psychiatry sees depersonalization disorder. When someone describes unity consciousness, psychiatry sees grandiose delusions. When someone speaks of inner guidance, psychiatry hears auditory hallucinations. The experience remains the same, but the interpretation, and therefore the treatment, becomes radically, dangerously different. Here's what you need to understand. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-5 that psychiatrists use to diagnose mental illness, does include something called a V code, specifically V code 6289, designated for religious or spiritual problem. This code exists precisely because the psychiatric community recognizes that spiritual experiences can be confused with psychopathology. It's an acknowledgement that not every extraordinary state of consciousness is a symptom of mental illness. But here's the critical problem. Research shows that 92% of clinicians feel dissatisfied with the current diagnostic criteria. They struggle to distinguish genuine spiritual emergency from psychotic episodes. And when in doubt, when a clinician cannot clearly differentiate, the system defaults to the medical model. It defaults to diagnosis. It defaults to intervention. It defaults to medication. Let me paint you a specific picture of how this plays out. You're in the middle of a Kundalini awakening. You feel intense heat moving up your spine. You experience energy currents, what yogic traditions call prana, flowing through channels in your body that you never knew existed. You have moments where your sense of individual self dissolves into something infinite and interconnected. These are documented, mapped experiences in spiritual traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Christian mysticism. For thousands of years, practitioners have recognized these as signs of spiritual development, challenging and intense, yes, but transformational, not pathological. But you walk into your therapist's office and describe these symptoms. What does the therapist hear? They hear somatic delusions, the false belief that something physical is happening in your body that isn't real. They hear depersonalization, a dissociative symptom where you feel detached from yourself. They note the disruption to your normal functioning, the intensity of your experience, perhaps the fear and confusion you're expressing. And suddenly you're not someone going through a spiritual emergence. You're someone presenting with symptoms consistent with a psychotic disorder. There are documented cases in medical literature where individuals experiencing Kundalini awakenings were diagnosed with schizophrenia, catatonic subtype, and prescribed powerful antipsychotic medications like risperidone. The medication didn't heal them. It didn't support their transformation. It shut it down. It suppressed the very process that was trying to unfold. And these individuals were left not only with the challenging work of spiritual integration, but with psychiatric labels, medication side effects, and the trauma of having their most profound experience pathologized and medicated away. Now, you might be wondering, how trained professionals can make such mistakes? How can someone confuse spiritual awakening with mental illness? The answer lies in understanding what we're comparing. The symptoms do overlap. They genuinely do. Someone going through ego death and someone experiencing a psychotic break might both report that their sense of self is dissolving. Someone connecting with inner guidance and someone experiencing auditory hallucinations might both describe hearing voices. Someone perceives the interconnected nature of reality, and someone experiencing ideas of reference might both see patterns and meanings everywhere. The symptoms can appear similar, but the context, the quality, and the outcome are radically different. Psychiatrist Stanislav Grof, one of the founders of transpersonal psychology, spent decades studying what he called spiritual emergencies. Transformational crises that look like psychological breakdown, but are actually psychological breakthrough. He and his wife Christina identified specific characteristics that distinguish spiritual emergency from psychosis. In spiritual emergency, the person maintains some capacity for reflection. They doubt the objective reality of their experience even as they're having it. They seek meaning in what's happening. The experience, though destabilizing, has a quality of opening, of expansion, of moving towards something greater. In genuine psychosis, there's typically certainty about delusional reality. There's loss of insight. The person cannot see that their perception might be distorted. There's fragmentation rather than integration. And critically, the experience tends to impair functioning in lasting ways rather than catalyzing growth and transformation. But here's the problem that puts you at risk. These distinctions require expertise in transpersonal psychology. They require a clinician who understands spiritual development, who has studied consciousness beyond the materialist paradigm, who can hold space for experiences that don't fit conventional Western models. And most therapists, through no fault of their own, weren't trained in this. Their education was rooted entirely in pathology models. They learned to identify symptoms and diagnose disorders. They weren't taught the maps of consciousness that exist in Buddhist psychology, or Vedantic philosophy, or Christian mysticism, or shamanic traditions. So, when you sit in that office and begin to tell the truth, you're essentially speaking a language your therapist may not understand. And when people encounter a language they don't understand, they interpret it through the framework they do have. For a conventional therapist trained only in Western psychiatric models, the framework available is pathology. Your awakening gets filtered through diagnostic criteria designed to identify illness, not transformation. The consequences of this misinterpretation aren't merely philosophical. They're material, and they can be severe. If a therapist believes you're experiencing psychosis, they have a duty to assess your safety. If they determine you might be a danger to yourself or others, and the disorientation that often accompanies spiritual emergency can certainly appear concerning someone unfamiliar with the territory, they can initiate an involuntary psychiatric hold. Research from 2024 on involuntary psychiatric hospitalization shows that these interventions can increase risk of suicide, create lasting trauma, and result in loss of civil liberties. Once you're in the psychiatric system with certain diagnoses, you've created a permanent record that affects insurance, employment, custody cases, and your ability to refuse treatment in the future. And the treatment itself, the antipsychotic medications that are standard intervention for suspected psychotic episodes. These drugs don't distinguish between pathological hallucinations and mystical visions. They suppress neurological activity across the board. Multiple accounts from individuals in spiritual awakening communities describe how psychiatric medications shut down their spiritual experiences entirely. Not by healing them, but by chemically suppressing the very states of consciousness where transformation occurs. It's like being in the middle of a metamorphosis and having someone inject you with a substance that hardens your cocoon from the inside. Alan Watts spoke about this with remarkable clarity. He understood that Western culture's commitment to ego-based consciousness makes it fundamentally hostile to ego-transcendent experiences. The ego, that constructed sense of separate self that society depends upon for functioning, experiences its own dissolution as death. And from the ego's perspective, it is death. When you're going through awakening and the boundaries of your separate self begin to dissolve, when you touch states of consciousness where there is no separate, you are experiencing things but only experience itself. This is terrifying to the ego structure, and it's equally terrifying to a psychological system built entirely on maintaining and healing the ego. Watts pointed out that enlightenment, awakening, liberation, whatever term you use, involves recognizing that the separate self you've taken yourself to be is a kind of hallucination. It's a useful convention, a necessary fiction for navigating social reality, but it's not ultimately true. You are not a skin-encapsulated ego. You are the entire process of existence expressing itself as a temporary pattern called you. This recognition is the very foundation of Eastern spiritual teaching. But Western psychology, rooted in Cartesian dualism and materialist science, operates from the assumption that this separate self is the foundation of mental health. So, when someone begins to see through the illusion, when the boundaries start to become permeable, the psychological establishment sees pathology where the spiritual tradition sees progress. This creates an impossible situation for you. You're going through one of the most profound processes a human being can experience. You need support. You need guidance. You need someone who can help you integrate these expansive states with the practical demands of daily life. And yet the very institutions designed to provide mental health support may be fundamentally unable to recognize what's happening to you as anything other than a problem to be fixed, a symptom to be suppressed, a crisis to be controlled. So, what do you do? How do you navigate this landscape? How do you find support without walking into danger? First, understand the language that triggers alarm. Certain phrases, when spoken in a conventional therapeutic context, set off immediate red flags in a clinician's mind. If you say, "I'm hearing voices," the therapist hears auditory hallucinations. If you say, "I know I'm connected to God," the therapist might hear grandiose delusions. If you say, "I felt like I was dying and dissolving into nothing," the therapist might hear depersonalization and suicidal ideation. These aren't wrong interpretations within the psychiatric framework. They're appropriate clinical responses to language that matches diagnostic criteria for serious conditions. You can describe the same experiences using different language that's more accurately heard. Instead of hearing voices, you might say, "I've developed a stronger connection to my intuition, like an internal guidance system." Instead of "connected to God," you might say, "I feel a profound sense of meaning and connection to something larger than myself." Instead of dissolving, you might say, "I've had experiences of expanded awareness where my normal sense of boundaries felt more fluid." You're not lying. You're not hiding your truth. You're translating your experience into language that can be received without triggering psychiatric emergency protocols. Second, Be very clear about your functioning. One of the key criteria that determines whether a spiritual experience gets labeled as a psychiatric emergency is whether you can still function in daily life. If you're able to maintain your responsibilities, if you're taking care of yourself, if you're not engaging in dangerous behaviors, if you can still think clearly about practical matters even as you're having profound experiences, these are crucial signs that differentiate spiritual emergency from psychotic break. Make this clear: I'm still going to work. I'm eating and sleeping, though the patterns have shifted. I'm not a danger to myself or anyone else. What I'm experiencing is disorienting, but I'm managing it and seeking to understand it. Third, seek out transpersonal therapists specifically. These are clinicians who've been trained in the intersection of psychology and spirituality. They understand consciousness in broader terms than conventional Western psychology. Organizations like the Spiritual Emergence Network maintain directories of therapists who specialize in exactly what you're going through. The Association for Transpersonal Psychology, the International Spiritual Emergence Network. These resources exist precisely because there's a recognized need for mental health support that doesn't pathologize spiritual experience. Finding the right therapist, one who speaks your language, who recognizes awakening when they see it, who can hold space for your expansion without trying to contract you back into conventional consciousness. This changes everything. Fourth, understand that some experiences are safer shared in peer support rather than clinical contexts, at least initially. Spiritual awakening communities, meditation groups, people who've been through their own transformations. These spaces offer validation and practical wisdom that can be profoundly healing. You need mirrors. You need people who can reflect to you that what you're experiencing isn't madness, isn't pathology, isn't something wrong with you, but is instead something that humans have been experiencing and navigating for as long as consciousness has been exploring itself. These communities can help you integrate your experiences and develop language for them before you attempt to communicate with them in therapeutic settings where they might be misunderstood. Fifth, educate yourself about the territory you're moving through. Read the works of Stanislav and Christina Grof on spiritual emergency. Study the maps of consciousness in traditions like Buddhism, which describe stages of insight and the challenging experiences that arise. Learn about the dark night of the soul in Christian mysticism, about Kundalini in yogic traditions, about shamanic initiation crises. When you understand that what you're experiencing has been mapped, has been navigated by countless others, has been recognized as part of the human journey toward expanded consciousness, it provides context that can be stabilizing. You're not losing your mind. You're following a path that's ancient and honored, even if your culture doesn't recognize it. And here's something crucial that Alan Watts would want you to understand. This tension between spiritual awakening and psychiatric diagnosis reveals something fundamental about the limitations of Western consciousness itself. The fact that our culture's healing institutions can make mistakes in transformation for pathology isn't just an unfortunate oversight. It's a symptom of a deeper confusion about the nature of consciousness, reality, and what it means to be human. We live in a civilization that has mastered external technology while remaining deeply uncomfortable with internal transformation. We've split the world into subject and objects, mind and matter, self and other, and we've built entire systems of thought, medicine, and social organization on these splits. When someone begins to experience the dissolution of these artificial boundaries, when they touch the unitive consciousness that mystics and sages have described for millennia, our systems literally don't know what to do with them. This isn't anyone's fault, exactly. Your therapist isn't trying to harm you. The psychiatric system isn't malicious. They're working within paradigms they were given, using tools they were taught, trying genuinely to help. But the paradigms themselves are limited. They're based on a materialist worldview that sees consciousness as nothing more than brain chemistry, that views the ego as the self rather than as a construct, that has no conceptual space for transpersonal dimensions of human experience. So, when you exercise caution about what you share, you're not being inauthentic. You're wise. You're recognizing that not every space is prepared to hold every truth. You understand that sometimes preservation of your transformation requires discernment about where and how you share it. This isn't spiritual bypassing. This isn't avoidance. This is skillful means, the Buddhist concept of adapting your approach to the capacities of your audience and the demands of your situation. There will come a time, if you find the right support, when you can speak fully and freely about what's happening to you. When you can describe the dissolution of self, the mystical visions, the energy phenomena, the synchronistic experiences, the dark nights, the expansions into unity consciousness of it, and have someone receive it not with diagnostic concern but with recognition and respect. That therapeutic relationship is possible. That quality of support exists, but it requires finding guides who've been trained to see awakening when it appears, who understand that the human journey includes possibilities for consciousness that conventional psychology barely acknowledges. Until you find that support, protect yourself. Be discerning. Speak the language that can be heard without triggering intervention you don't need. Use peer support, community books, teachings, your own inner guidance to navigate what you're experiencing. Trust that your experiences are valid, even if you can't yet speak to them fully in every context. Trust that transformation, real transformation, has always been challenging to communicate across paradigms. Trust that you're not alone in this predicament. Countless awakened souls throughout history have faced the challenge of honoring their experience while navigating cultures that couldn't recognize what was happening to them. And know this, the fact that Western psychiatry sometimes mistakes awakening for illness doesn't make your awakening any less real. It doesn't mean you're mentally ill. It doesn't mean your experiences aren't valid. It means that the maps available in conventional psychology don't yet include the territory you're exploring. It means that consciousness is larger than any single culture's framework for understanding it. It means that your experience is pushing against the edges of what your society considers possible, normal, or real. This is what awakened souls have always done. They've touched something beyond consensus reality. They've seen through constructs that everyone else takes as solid. They've experienced dimensions of consciousness that the dominant paradigm insists don't exist. And they've had to find ways to honor their truth while living in a world that can't always recognize it. Your spiritual awakening is real. Your experiences matter. The transformation you're undergoing is valid and valuable. Not just for you, but for the collective consciousness that's slowly, gradually learning to expand beyond the limitations that have confined it. But your awakening also needs protection, especially in its early vulnerable stages. It needs the right kind of support, the right kind of space, the right kind of language. So be wise. Be discerning. Be honest with yourself even when you must be careful with others. Find your tribe, find transpersonal support, find guides who recognize the territory. And above all, trust the process that's unfolding in you. Trust that consciousness knows how to wake itself up. Trust that your inner guidance, however it comes to you, is worthy of respect. Trust that you have the capacity to navigate both worlds, the world of practical life and the world of spiritual transformation, without sacrificing either. The journey you're on is profound. It's challenging, it's destabilizing at times, but it's not pathology. It's not illness. It's not something wrong with you. It's something deeply, essentially right. Consciousness recognizing itself, limitations dissolving, truth emerging. Honor it. Protect it. Find the support that can hold it. And trust that as you do, you're not only healing yourself, but contributing to a larger shift in how humanity understands consciousness, transformation, and what it means to be awake. If this exploration resonated with you, if it named something you've been living but couldn't quite articulate, then you're part of a growing community of awakened souls learning to navigate these territories together. Subscribe to Alan Watts Insights for more wisdom that bridges ancient understanding and modern experience. Share this with someone who needs to hear, someone sitting in their own therapist's office wondering what's safe to say. And leave a comment sharing your experience. Your voice matters. Your journey matters. And together we're creating the language, the support, and the understanding that the next generation of awakening souls will be able to draw upon. Trust the process. Trust your experience. Trust that life is guiding you exactly where you need to go. And know that in the vast web of consciousness, you are never, ever alone.